The night ocean stretched out like a sheet of black glass, silent except for the low rumble of engines rolling across its surface. A Japanese convoy, transports, tankers, and two escort destroyers moved slowly through the darkness, their running lights extinguished, their crews whispering in hushed tones. They believed the night protected them. They believed the ocean hid them. They believed American bombers could not find what they could not see. For years, Japanese convoys had depended on darkness. Night masked the thin columns of ships carrying fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements between distant islands. Night shielded them from carrier strikes. Night kept submarines at bay. And night grounded most American bombers whose crews needed daylight to sight their targets. But in 1944, the night betrayed them. A new sound drifted down from the upper atmosphere, not loud, not obvious at first, but unmistakable to those who understood what hunted them. It was the deep, steady hum of four massive engines moving through the sky with the calm assurance of something unstoppable. A B-29 Superfortress flew 28,000 feet above the convoy, invisible against the moonless sky. Below, the Japanese sailors scanned the heavens but saw nothing. The bomber was too high, too fast, too silent at that distance, but it wasn't searching with eyes. It was searching with something else. Inside the B-29's dimly lit cabin, the radar operator sat hunched over the glowing green screen of an AN/APQ-13 radar set. The screen pulsed with circular sweeps that revealed nothing at first but waves and echoes. Then a cluster of blips appeared near the center, faint but unmistakably geometric. "Convoy detected," the operator murmured. "Bearing 144 degrees, multiple returns, looks like 3 large ships, maybe more." The bombardier laned in, range 30 miles and closing. The pilot didn't hesitate, "Bring us over them." In the darkness outside, the B-29 adjusted its course with the slightest turn of its massive wing. The Japanese convoy continued unaware, moving at a cautious 8 knots through the vast expanse of ocean. The sailors listened for aircraft, strained their eyes for silhouettes, and kept watch for torpedo wakes, but none of their senses could detect what was coming. Radar had erased the ocean's greatest defense: invisibility. The B-29 descended slowly to bombing altitude, but still far higher than any Japanese ship could detect. At 20,000 feet, the air was thin, cold, and hostile, but radar didn't care. Radar saw through the darkness, through clouds, through distance, revealing everything below with quiet certainty. In the bomb bay, 12 500-pound bombs sat ready, each fitted with a proximity fuse tuned perfectly for maritime targets. They were designed not to pierce a ship's hull, but to explode beside it, using the pressure wave to tear open steel like paper. The bombs hung in rows, gently swaying with the vibration of the engines. The radar operator began calling out corrections. "Convoy shifting course, 2 degrees starboard, maintain heading, maintain heading." The bombardier didn't look out the window, there was nothing to see. Instead, he watched the radar repeater, waiting for the convoy's blips to align exactly with the crosshair rings overlaying the green glow. Japanese sailors looked upward nervously. Some sensed something was wrong, an eerie feeling, a pressure in the air, but they saw nothing. The darkness remained complete. The sky remained silent. Only the distant roll of waves suggested anything living on the surface of the Pacific. Then the bombardier whispered, "Bombs away." The B-29 lurched slightly upward as the massive payload dropped into the void below. The bombs fell silently at first, accelerating through the thin air, their fins spinning. They were invisible, unheard, unseen. No sirens, no searchlights, no warning. The convoy continued forward for nearly 20 seconds before the first explosion hit. A blinding white flash erupted beside the lead transport, followed a moment later by a towering column of water and flame. The blast wave slammed into the ship's hull, bending steel plates inward, rupturing compartments, killing dozens instantly. The ship listed sharply, alarms echoing across its decks. Before anyone could react, another blast hit the second ship, then another, and another. Explosions walked across the convoy in perfect spacing, each strike pre-plotted by radar guidance, each one devastating. On the destroyer escorting the convoy, the captain shouted orders to ready anti-air guns, but his crew stared upward helplessly. They could see nothing. They fired anyway, long streams of tracers arcing into empty sky. Their desperation illuminated the water below but revealed no enemy. What the Japanese Marines and sailors did not understand was that radar had broken the rules of war. Bombers no longer needed eyes on target, no longer needed flares, no longer needed moonlight. They could attack from altitudes beyond the reach of every Japanese weapon on the convoy. And worse, the bombs were not random scatterings dropped into darkness. They were radar-aligned, radar-guided, radar-corrected. Every few seconds, the B-29's operator made small adjustments, refining the attack path with eerie precision. A convoy evasive maneuvers, shifting left, adjusting aim. More bombs fell. Below, chaos spread like fire across the water. Men shouted. Searchlights swung wildly, illuminating empty patches of clouds. Officers screamed orders that no longer meant anything. Ships zigzagged desperately, but the bombs continued landing around them, indifferent to their evasion. One tanker carrying thousands of gallons of fuel took a near miss that ignited its deck. Flames erupted across the ship, rolling down its length in violent waves. The night sky turned orange, revealing the silhouettes of the terrified crew scrambling across the deck. A Marine corporal aboard the transport closest to the blaze stared upward with trembling hands. "Where are they?" he whispered. "Where are the aircraft?" A veteran beside him shook his head. "There is no bomber, it is a ghost." Another explosion answered him, rocking the transport violently. Men fell to the deck, hatches buckled. A massive section of hull ripped open, sending seawater rushing inside. The convoy commander, watching the destruction unfold, understood the truth with horrifying clarity. The Americans could strike anywhere, at any time, without warning, without light, without being seen. The night that once protected them now protected the enemy. By the time the last bomb hit, 3 ships were sinking. One was engulfed in flames, another was dead in the water, and the escorts were circling aimlessly, firing into darkness, hoping to hit something, anything, to convince themselves they were not helpless. But the B-29 was long gone. It had turned away minutes earlier, climbing back into the thin upper layers of the atmosphere, engines humming steadily as though returning from a routine patrol. Inside, the crew spoke softly, their tone calm, professional, unshaken. What was the final tally? Radar returns suggest 4 ships hit, 1 probably gone. And visual. The bombardier shrugged, never saw a thing. The bomber disappeared into the night sky. The Japanese sailors below watched the burning remains of their convoy drift apart. Some clung to debris. Some prayed. Some cursed into the wind. None understood how the Americans had found them. None understood how they had been struck so precisely. None understood how an attack could be carried out without ever seeing the target. But this was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, Japanese convoys began disappearing at an alarming rate. Entire groups of transports vanished between islands. Supply routes that had once been risky became fatal. Ships often left port knowing they might not return, and that their attackers would remain invisible ghosts in the sky. Radar bombing had changed everything. American commanders realized that radar had turned the B-29 into a predator that hunted by echo, not sight. Convoys traveling at night, once safe from air attack, were now more vulnerable than ever. And as the Japanese tried to adapt, the B-29s only grew more efficient. Radar operators learned how to distinguish convoys from waves, from islands, from clouds. They learned how to detect escort ships. They learned how to predict evasive maneuvers. Some operators became so skilled they could identify ship classes by the shape of their radar blips. Japanese intelligence received reports from survivors describing the same nightmare repeatedly. No sirens, no aircraft sighted, only explosions falling from the sky with surgical precision. Some sailors insisted the Americans must have developed invisible aircraft. Others believed the bombs were falling from submarines or satellites. One Marine officer wrote in his journal, "The Americans bomb in darkness, they kill without light, they are not men, they are ghosts of the sky." Convoy commanders requested more escorts, more anti-air guns, more searchlights, but none of it mattered. Radar bombing did not depend on visibility. Anti-aircraft fire could not reach high-altitude B-29s. Searchlights could not penetrate the upper layers of the atmosphere. And worse, the more ships a convoy had, the larger their radar signature was. By late 1944, the Japanese Navy realized the horrifying truth. Large convoys were easier to find. Small convoys were easier to destroy. So no convoy could hide. Radar had removed the ocean's last refuge. As B-29s refined the tactic, their bombings grew even more terrifying. Bombing runs became smoother, more accurate, more confident. Radar operators began guiding entire formations of B-29s, allowing multiple bombers to strike the same convoy within minutes. Convoys that survived one raid often didn't survive the second. Japanese Marines and sailors soon faced a new fear, not of bombs, but of the unseen enemy guiding them. The radar. They began speaking about it as if it were supernatural. It sees everything. It knows where we are. It follows us. It hunts without eyes. A Marine sergeant wrote, "Daylight is dangerous. Night is worse. The Americans have stolen the night." American bombers, once limited by darkness, now thrived in it. In Tokyo, naval strategists pored over charts showing lost convoys. The red marks were everywhere, from the Philippines to the Bonins to the South China Sea. Supply routes vital to Japan's war effort were bleeding out, one night at a time. But the worst was still coming. The Americans were about to combine radar bombing with something even more devastating: coordinated radar sweeps that allowed entire bomber groups to share targeting data across dozens of aircraft. When that began, Japanese convoys didn't just struggle. They collapsed. The Japanese sailors aboard the convoy ships had always trusted the night. Darkness was their ally, their shield against American submarines and aircraft. For years, it had been their single greatest defense. When the sun dipped below the horizon, their fear faded. They believed the sky became blind. They believed the sea became safe. But after the first B-29 radar-guided bombing attack, night no longer brought relief. It brought dread. Crewmen stood on deck watching the black horizon, their hearts pounding with every gust of wind. The sky looked empty, but they no longer trusted their eyes. Somewhere above them, possibly 5 miles up, possibly 10, they knew American bombers might be circling, unseen, unheard, hunting them with a machine that did not fear darkness. Radar. A technology most Japanese sailors did not understand, and none could escape. The convoy's commander paced the bridge of his flagship, studying the map lit by a single dim lantern. His officers whispered anxiously about the previous night's attack. Not a single bomber had been spotted. Not a single engine had been heard. The bombs simply fell, accurate, devastating, impossible. One destroyer captain summarized the terror perfectly. We never saw them, they saw everything. At midnight, the fleet changed course. They zigzagged cautiously, adjusting speed, cutting engine power to reduce their profile against the water, but even that felt useless. How do you hide from an enemy that no longer relied on light? How do you evade aircraft guided by invisible waves? The ships plowed forward, nervous, tense, exhausted. Hours passed, and then it happened again. Far above the clouds, 3 B-29s closed in on the conv, flying in a perfect triangular formation. Their cockpits were dark, their gunners were silent, their engines were throttled to a low droning hum. Inside the lead aircraft, the radar operator leaned over his glowing screen, watching the ghostly shapes of Japanese ships sliding across the circular display like shadows drifting over snow. The sea below was pitch black. The ships below were blind. But the bomber above saw everything. The radar operator spoke calmly into his microphone. Convoy dead ahead, coordinates locked. The bombardier nodded, adjusting the intervalometer. No need for searchlights, no need for flares. The bombs would guide themselves. No, the radar would guide them. The bombardier merely calibrated the system and waited. The B-29 descended slightly, stabilizing at altitude. The convoy below felt nothing. No sound. No warning. And then the bombs fell. High-explosive ordnance dropped from the belly of the aircraft like metallic rain, slicing downward through complete darkness. Sailors aboard the Japanese ships looked around wildly when the first whistle pierced the night sky. Some thought it was wind. Others thought it was superstition. But moments later, the ocean erupted. A column of water blasted upward beside a transport ship, engulfing its deck. Men were knocked off their feet. Officers screamed for lights, for bearings, for explanations. Another explosion followed, then another, each one walking closer to the convoy. Every blast was perfectly aligned, as if the bombers could see the ships with godlike clarity. The Japanese knew this was no coincidence. This was precision. This was radar. Above the chaos, the B-29s banked gently and repositioned. Their pilots could see the convoy's new headings on the radar screen, every hesitant turn, every desperate maneuver. The Japanese believed they were evading in darkness, but the darkness was no longer theirs. Inside the second bomber, the pilot watched the glowing shapes move across the radar display. "They're trying to run," he said quietly. The radar operator smirked. "Let them, they can't run from this." The bombardier released another stick of bombs. They fell silently. Then the ocean lit up again. Below, a Japanese destroyer took a direct hit near its forward magazine. The explosion punched through the deck like a sledgehammer. Flames burst through the hull. The ship tilted, groaning, as sailors scrambled to extinguish fires with buckets, hoses, anything they could grab. Officers shouted conflicting orders, unable to understand how the bombers were finding them. No flares, no lights. This must be guesswork, random fire. But the bombs weren't random. They were following the convoy with mathematical certainty. The destroyer crewmen stared upward in fear, but the bombers were too high, hidden by clouds and stars. They might as well have been ghosts. The attack lasted 8 minutes. 8 minutes of explosions, fire, confusion, and panic. Then the B-29s vanished back into the night, engines humming softly as they turned for home. They never saw the burning ships behind them. They didn't need to. They had seen them perfectly an hour earlier. The convoy suffered 2 losses that night. A third ship limped away trailing smoke. The others scattered, terrified of the unseen enemy above. The next morning, Japanese Naval HQ received fragmented, panicked reports. Officers gathered in a tense emergency meeting, trying to interpret the pattern. How did they find you? Were there moon breaks? Did any aircraft spot you before nightfall? Did submarines guide the bombers? Each question was met with the same answer. We saw nothing. Later, as survivors were interviewed, the disturbing truth surfaced. The Americans didn't need to see them. News of radar bombing spread rapidly among sailors. Rumors twisted into nightmares. Convoy crews began imagining B-29s floating above them like silent predators. Some sailors claimed they could feel the radar waves crawling across their skin. Others believed the Americans could see through clouds, rain, fog, even through the ocean itself. Panic was becoming its own weapon. The Americans refined the tactic even further. On the next operation, 6 B-29s flew in staggered altitude layers. Each bomber's radar operator tracked the convoy independently, comparing readings to create a perfect situational map. Their signals overlapped, creating a more detailed picture than any Japanese lookout scanning the horizon with binoculars. The lead bomber sent a coded pulse to the others. Target acquired, begin pattern. The formation turned. The radar screens glowed brighter. The Japanese convoy sailed into the kill zone without ever knowing it existed. Bomb bay doors opened. The night erupted again. A transport ship carrying ammunition took a direct hit and disappeared instantly in a flash of white-hot flame. Another ship burst into fire as a near-miss punched molten steel through its hull. The convoy broke formation, each ship swerving wildly to escape the unseen demons above. On the destroyer Yuzuki, sailors frantically searched the sky for silhouettes. They saw none. Their captain ordered anti-aircraft fire anyway. The guns roared into empty darkness, tracers arcing upward like hopeless prayers. The B-29s didn't even notice. They were too high, too far, too guided. Japanese sailors watched in terror as the bombs continued falling, not scattered, not random, but in organized lines that marched across the ocean's surface like rows of invisible soldiers. A young machine gunner whispered, "We are fighting ghosts. Ghosts who see in the dark." The ship's captain could offer no better explanation. Another explosion tore through the night. Another transport ship sank. The Americans circled once more before retreating to base. Their radar had mapped the entire engagement clearly, every maneuver the convoy attempted, every ship's position at every minute. They had become hunters in the night, writing a new chapter in warfare. For the Japanese, the psychological effect was catastrophic. Convoy commanders began refusing nighttime movement. Sailors begged not to serve in supply fleets. Morale collapsed as fear spread through every ship. Warriors who once faced submarines, storms, and air attacks with unwavering resolve now trembled at the thought of invisible bombers drifting overhead. Japan was losing the war of nerves long before they lost the war of ships. The next convoy attempted to disguise itself by shutting down all radios, traveling slowly and hugging island shadows. But the Americans had anticipated this too. Radar didn't care about speed. Radar didn't care about silence. Radar didn't care about deception. It saw everything. At 2:13 a.m. the first bomb hit. At 2:19 a.m. the convoy scattered. At 2:32 a.m. the lead ship sank with all hands. By 3:00 a.m. the convoy was gone. The Japanese High Command could no longer deny it. They were losing not to aircraft, not to weapons, but to something much more terrifying: precision in the dark. American radar bombing had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. And the Japanese convoy system, once the spine of their supply network, began to collapse. One sailor wrote in his diary, "The sea used to hide us. Now it betrays us. And the sky knows everything." The sea south of Japan had once been a corridor of life. Convoys carried fuel, ammunition, grain, rubber, steel, and the endless resources needed to feed a war machine fighting on dozens of fronts. Every ship, every tanker, every freighter was a lifeline. Japanese commanders treated each voyage with sacred urgency. Without them, the factories went silent, the airfields went empty, the armies starved. But by late 1944, after months of relentless nighttime B-29 radar strikes, the lifeline had become a graveyard. Convoys no longer moved like proud columns. They crept, they hesitated, they hid in coves waiting for moonless nights. They took long, looping routes to avoid known attack corridors. Some ships traveled alone, believing solitude offered better odds than being part of a doomed flock. It didn't matter. The radar saw them all. American analysts already knew the shipping routes. Japanese ships leaving Singapore, Saigon, or Taiwan had to pass through specific choke points, narrow stretches of sea where radar returns appeared like clockwork. Once the B-29 crews understood the rhythm, the convoys became predictable. The ocean was vast, but the places where ships had to be were not. And those were the places the superfortresses visited again and again. Japanese escort commanders grew desperate. They ordered their radar operators to search constantly, sweeping the sky for the deep humming signature of B-29 engines. They tried blacking out the convoys entirely, but the radar bombs didn't need light. They tried hugging coastlines, but the coastline only gave the B-29's high-contrast radar silhouettes to aim at. They tried slowing to reduce the wake, but slow ships were even easier to hit. Every adjustment seemed to help the Americans more than the Japanese. One destroyer captain wrote in his log, "We are no longer fighting aircraft, we are fighting inevitability." He was right. The B-29 radar operators sat calmly at their scopes, interpreting green blips with practiced ease. They adjusted dials. They refined the gain. They recognized the faint shadows of convoys hiding in rain squalls and the stronger returns of escorts circling protectively. The Japanese never saw the bombers. They only saw what the bombers left behind. On one infamous night, a convoy of 7 Japanese transports moved north under the thickest cloud layer they had seen in months. The waves crashed against the hulls. Visibility was nearly zero. The convoy commander felt, for the first time in weeks, a sense of hope. "Tonight," he declared, "the Americans cannot see us." But hundreds of miles away, on the ground in the Mariana Islands, a radar operator watched a faint, almost ghost-like smear move across his screen, a formation of ships hidden beneath cloud and sea haze. He called the operations officer. The officer alerted the B-29 base. Within minutes, engines roared to life. In the black sky over the Pacific, a flight of superfortresses climbed into the clouds. The crews joked half-heartedly, shared coffee, and checked their bomb fuses one last time. They didn't know the details of the conv. They didn't need to. Radar would show them everything. Hours later, the B-29 formation reached the target zone. Radar operators switched from search to tracking mode. The convoy appeared almost instantly, 7 close-together blips, 3 smaller ones circling them. "It looks tight," the lead operator muttered. "Tighter is better," the bombardier replied. The bomb bay doors opened. Cold night air filled the aircraft. Below, the Japanese convoy still believed they were hidden. Then the ocean flashed. Bombs fell cleanly through the clouds, guided not by eyesight but by invisible waves of energy bouncing back into the bombers' instruments. Explosions tore through the sea surface. Water columns rose higher than the masts. A transport broke in half. Another erupted into flame, its fuel tanks igniting the night. The convoy commander, horrified, stared upward through the clouds but saw nothing. Only darkness, thunder, and the distant rumble of engines he could not pinpoint. "Where are they?" a sailor shouted. His officer answered with trembling certainty. "Everywhere." In reality, the B-29s were miles above them, drifting in and out of cloud layers like ghosts. The Japanese escorts fired blindly into the sky. Their shells burst in useless spheres of light far beneath the bomber's altitude. Radar jammers, installed hurriedly in the preceding months, proved ineffective. American radar wavelengths cut through the interference like knives through paper. The convoy lost 5 ships in less than 10 minutes. As dawn approached, the survivors limped toward Okinawa. Lookouts scanned the sky, terrified of another attack. Submarine commanders in the region searched for wreckage, stunned at the scale of destruction. Naval staff ashore read the incoming reports with silent dread. The convoy system had not just been damaged, it had collapsed. Over the next weeks, Japanese throughput dropped catastrophically. Fuel deliveries slowed to a trickle. Ammunition depots rationed every shell. Factories that once produced engines, aircraft frames, and ship components began shutting down shifts entirely. Civilian workers waited in lines for rice that never arrived. Pilots trained in simulators because aviation gasoline had become too precious to waste. Empire-wide shortages grew with every sinking. And still, the B-29 radar bombing continued. The Japanese tried everything: decoys, dummy ships, false wakes, zigzag patterns, night sailings, weather escapes. Nothing worked. The radar saw through every trick. Even when ships ran without lights, without radio, without any detectable emissions, the radar picked them up as bright as ever. The Americans now possessed something Japan could not counter: the ability to see without seeing. One night, a small convoy of oil tankers hugged the Philippine coastline, hoping the jagged outline of mountains would confuse American radar. For a short while it worked. The image split into fragments, blending with land clutter. But then one B-29 switched to a narrower beam. Another adjusted the frequency. A third shifted its angle of attack. The radar picture sharpened. 4 tankers, 2 escorts, moving at 9 knots. The Relied B dropped its bombs. 2 tankers exploded into boiling fireballs. A third began leaking burning fuel that spread across the ocean like a floating inferno. The escorts fired in every direction, but there was nothing to shoot at. Again and again, these scenes repeated themselves. Flashes on the ocean, screaming men, sinking ships, empty coastlines waiting for supplies that would never arrive. Soon, the Japanese Navy began a desperate policy: sail in the day instead of night. It was madness. American submarines prowled those waters relentlessly. American aircraft from carriers and islands could spot convoys miles away. But the Navy reasoned: at least during the day we can see the bombers. It made no difference. B-29 radar could lock onto ships in broad daylight just as easily as in darkness. And with visual confirmation, the bombers became even deadlier. More ships burned. More convoys scattered. More sailors died trying to protect cargo that would never reach Japan. By late winter, Japanese commanders issued internal memos that carried an unprecedented tone. "We cannot protect our convoys." It was the one statement no navy ever wishes to write. The economic collapse was rapid and severe. Fuel shortages grounded entire air wings. Factories operated at 30% capacity. Destroyers sat in harbors unable to sortie because their tanks were empty. Trains stopped running in some prefectures. Food stocks shrank dangerously. A senior logistics officer wrote in a bleak report, "We have entered a phase where the question is not how to win the war, it is how long we can delay the inevitable." Yet the most chilling realization came when they studied convoy survival rates. Before radar bombing, 70% of convoys reached their destination. After radar bombing, fewer than 15% survived. The numbers told the story of a collapsing empire. Meanwhile, B-29 crews continued refining their techniques. Some operators learned to differentiate ship types based solely on radar reflection signatures. Others developed ways to identify escorts hiding behind the larger transports. Pilots adjusted bomb release timings to exploit ship-turning radar. Each improvement made every conv attack more lethal than the last. In Tokyo, naval staff reviewed the final reports with hollow eyes. They saw pages filled with losses, each ship a lifeline, each lifeline severed. The Japanese Navy, once proud, once daring, once feared across the Pacific, could now do nothing but watch as the arteries of their empire were cut one by one. And the cutting blade was not a submarine, or a torpedo, or a dive bomber, or a surface fleet. It was a radar beam inside the belly of a bomber flying where no escort could reach. American B-29s had rewritten the rules of maritime warfare. The Japanese convoys never adapted, they never escaped, they never stood a chance. And so the Japanese Navy's final chapter at sea was not written in battles between great fleets, but in the silent, invisible strikes of radar, blows that fell from above, precise and unseen, shattering the flow of fuel, food, and hope until the war machine collapsed entirely. By the time Japan realized the full extent of the damage, the convoys were gone. The fuel was gone. The Navy was gone, and the end was already approaching. Because an empire cannot fight without supplies. And the radar of the B-29 had ensured those supplies would never arrive again.